Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. My guest today, Stephane Dujarric, is a long-serving United Nations spokesperson who, on September 11th, 2001, was at his office at the United Nations when planes struck the World Trade Center. I've known Stephane for a long time and have known that he was in the building that day, but I hadn't spoken with him about it until now. He offers a ground's-eye view of what it was like to be at the UN that day, and as a long-serving senior UN spokesperson, he's able to give some perspective on how those attacks forever changed the United Nations. Before we dive into this conversation, I do want to plug our upcoming series, Global Dispatches at UNGA 76. We are preparing a week of special programming from the UN General Assembly starting September 20th. If you are listening to this contemporaneously, you will likely hear an ad from me that explains this special week of programming in more detail. Just get excited. Now here is my conversation with Stephane Dujarric, UN spokesperson.
I was the associate spokesman. At the time, I was working for Fred Eckhart. I had joined the UN about a year and a half before, in early 2000. My office was on the third floor, facing out, looking at First Avenue. And on September 11th, as it was on September 10th, I would be in the office at about 7 o'clock to work with Fred Eckhart on a morning news brief we would provide the Secretary General. It was Kofi Annan, of course, at the time. On September 11th, I was at my computer. The TV was on, but I wasn't really watching it. And my wife called and said, "Are you watching? There's a plane that hit the World Trade Center." So I turned on the TV. I was looking at the footage of the first plane. And I remember walking to Fred Eckhart's office and saying, "We should watch this." And we started watching. And I think if I recall, we kind of stopped doing what we were doing, just were glued to the television. And when the second plane hit, I remember going up to the 37th floor of the building,
Which is the executive office of Kofi Annan.
No, it's the floor. It's the floor right below.
Ah, okay.
So the Secretary General's on the 38th floor, and I went up to 37 because there was a good friend of mine who I knew worked there. I relatively was new to the UN, so I wasn't going to go around unannounced to his office. But I went to my friend's office, and we were looking at the window southbound, and we could see the smoke. And it kind of just hit me like it hit everybody else. And I remember going back downstairs. The Secretary General at the time was still at the residence. They decided to keep him at the residence. There was also a lot of confusing information that there was another plane in the air, that the UN was actually a target. That was being reported on the news. At the same time, my wife called a number of times telling me it was really time for me to come home. We had a newborn at the time. I was staying in the office. I stayed in the office. She's forgiven me, but I did stay in the office. And we regrouped with a number of senior officials. And again, I was just kind of tailing along, being one of the newbies in the group. And we met in the building, the General Assembly building, because we'd evacuated the Secretariat. And
was the idea that the General Assembly was supposedly more secure?
Well, I mean, it was just a safer place we felt to meet. And it's also important to remember that prior to 9/11, I mean, there was a lot of security at the UN, but it wasn't nearly at the level of security that we have now. I mean, the windows were not bulletproof as they are now. The garden, the front garden of the UN, which is absolutely beautiful, was open to the public. I mean, it was just, all of us, I mean, you included, and all of us had a different mindset. Mm-hmm. And we met there with the chef de cabinet, Iqbal Riza, and a number of people. They started drafting a statement. And by that time, it must have been about 11:30. I decided it would probably be best for me to go home. And my boss and others said to some of the more junior staffers, just go home. And myself and Marie Okabe, who was my colleague at the time, walked out. We both lived uptown, and no bus, obviously, but there were large groups of people walking up First Avenue. And for your listeners must know, the World Trade Center is all the way downtown. The UN is on 42nd Street. So it was already a long walk, and they had ash. They had dust on them. And I remember cars stopped in the street with their doors open, people listening to the radio. We walked up from 42nd to 57th, then walked east one block to Sutton Place, where the Secretary General's residence is. And there was a lot more security in front of his residence. I kept walking, and I remember distinctively, I didn't have money to get on the bus, but a bus stopped, and the guy was obviously just letting people in. And then I made it. I made it home. I made it home that evening.
What do you know now about what Kofi Annan was doing that morning at the residence and that day at the residence?
He was, he would usually come in about 9:15, 9:30. He was not he would work early from the residence, but wouldn't be in the office, at 8 o'clock. So it was kind of a normal morning for him. And then from that, there was quickly the Security Council meeting, General Assembly meeting. But beyond, I think, the official meetings, this was a crisis like no other for the UN, because the UN is obviously a global organization, but the UN headquarters, the UN community at the headquarters, we're New Yorkers. Whether you've moved to work for the UN 3 years ago, whether you've been there your whole life, whether you're a staff member or you're a diplomat, you have family here, you have children that go to school. This was a very personal attack as well, because we had to deal with the work that needed to be done, and everybody was very focused on it. But at the same time, you had to deal with your own family, your own anxieties, your own fears about what this all meant and what was happening. And then, of course, we have a number of colleagues who lost friends, who lost family in that attacks. And on top of that, as you well know, out of the 3,000 or so people that died on that day, they represented 90 countries. And there are 193 member states in the UN. So it hit us in so many levels.
What was the work that needed to be done in the immediate aftermath of September 11th at the UN?
Well, there was obviously security and making sure the UN was safe, but there was servicing the member states, which is what the Secretariat does.
What kind of requests were you getting from member states at the time?
Well, I mean, they needed to have Security Council meetings. They needed to have General Assembly meetings. They needed to be staffed in a time where there was a bit of panic in the city, right? And the Secretary General, Kofi Annan, also had to ensure that his voice to the world was heard, a voice of both condemning the extreme horror of the terrorist attack, a voice of unity in the face of violence and in the face of hatred.
And, part of your job as a spokesperson and as at the time, a communications official at the UN was, I suppose, to field press requests basically from around the world. Like, what kind of questions were you getting incoming from press?
Interestingly enough, I don't remember the kind of questions we were getting, except for one. We were going to host, I think around the 13th, 14th, or 15th of September, another round of talks about Cyprus with the representative of the Greek, the Greek community of Cyprus, the Turkish community of Cyprus, the two community leaders. And one of the calls that I got, and this was on September 11th in the afternoon, was what is the significance and what will be the impact of what happened today on the talks in Cyprus? I will never forget that call. And I know it's a call that I refer to that anecdotally once in a while to explain the press corps that we have here, that they're all, understandably so, very focused on their own issues. But this was really taking it to the extreme.
Looking back, today, 20 years on, could you identify any discernible legacy that, that still exists, manifests itself at the UN beyond like the day-to-day security issues?
I think the some of the, in terms of the substantive legacies is all the work that we are now doing on counterterrorism. Whether it's the Directorate of Counterterrorism that works directly with the Security Council, whether it's the Office of Counterterrorism that works now on supporting member states in their own fight against terrorism in terms of laws to make sure they adhere to human rights principles, in terms of capacity building. That is a direct legacy. And I think the other direct legacy has to do with the voices of the victims of terrorism. What September 11th really brought out was a kind of federation of voices of people who had been victims of terrorism, whether those people were in India, whether they were in Israel, whether they were in Pakistan, in France, in Belgium, or now in the US. It ensured that those people who suffered from terrorism, their voices are not forgotten and their voices are heard.
Looking forward, I mean, do you see that legacy of the September 11th attacks on the substantive work on the United Nations like ebbing in any way? Are priorities changing now that we're 20 years on?
No, I don't think so, because sadly, the scourge of terrorism has only increased since September 11th. The reach of ISIS, of Al-Shabaab, of Al-Qaeda is almost in the four corners of the world. There are very few countries that are untouched by terrorism. So in a sense, that legacy stays strong and is staying stronger. I think what we saw on September 11th and 12th and 13th, and in the days following at the UN, was an amazing unity of member states. Sadly, there have been the moments of complete unity of member states have been fleeting, and they've occurred throughout the history of the UN, but they're so powerful when they happen, but they dissipate so quickly. And that is such a shame when you look at the crisis that we're facing today, climate, COVID, to name just one, where the responses are anything but coordinated and unified.
Well, Stephane, thank you so much for your time.
Mark, always a pleasure.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Stephane. And I do know that the 20th anniversary of that awful day will be a heavy moment for many of those listening to this show. So just take time to take care of yourself. We'll see you next time. Bye.